Maybe if your wife stopped acting like a helpless old woman, dinner would be a lot more pleasant, my daughter-in-law said with a smile so polished that anyone outside the family might have mistaken it for kindness. The room fell silent. Forks hovered over half-finished plates. Glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. My wife, Eleanor, simply lowered her eyes toward the mashed potatoes she had spent the last hour making from scratch. She didn't defend herself. She never did. After 42 years of marriage, I knew every expression that crossed her face, and the one she wore that evening hurt me more than any angry outburst ever could. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't even sadness. It was disappointment. The kind that settles into a person's heart after being ignored one too many times. I looked around the table. My son Ryan cleared his throat, but said nothing. My sister pretended to adjust her napkin. My nephew suddenly became fascinated by the football game playing silently on the television in the next room. No one wanted to be the first person to challenge Vanessa. Somewhere over the past several years, she had become the loudest voice at every family gathering, and everyone else had quietly accepted that role. I wish I could tell you that I stood up immediately, slammed my hand on the table, and demanded an apology. That would have made for a dramatic story. But that isn't what happened. I simply reached for my glass of iced tea and took a slow sip. Then I looked at Eleanor. She forced a tiny smile in my direction, the same smile she had used every time life handed her something unfair. It was the smile she wore when she lost her mother. The smile she wore when I was laid off decades ago. The smile she wore through surgeries, financial setbacks, and every difficult season we had ever survived together. She had always carried pain quietly because she believed peace inside a family mattered more than winning an argument. Maybe that was why Vanessa believed she could say anything she wanted. Dinner had started so differently. The smell of fresh rolls still lingered in the dining room. The candles Eleanor insisted on lighting for Sunday dinners flickered softly against the polished oak table we had bought almost 30 years earlier. Every holiday, every birthday, every graduation dinner had happened around that same table. It wasn't expensive anymore by today's standards, but to us it represented decades of hard work, overtime shifts, careful budgeting, and countless family memories. Eleanor had ironed the tablecloth that afternoon. She even used the good china because our granddaughter had come home from college for the weekend. She wanted everyone to feel welcome. That was always her way. She believed kindness could fix almost anything. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and laughed lightly as though she had merely made an innocent joke. "I'm only saying what everyone else is thinking," she added before taking another bite of her dinner. A couple of uncomfortable chuckles escaped from the far end of the table. Ryan finally looked at his mother for less than a second before lowering his eyes again. That hurt Eleanor more than Vanessa's words ever could. I knew it because I saw her fingers tighten around her fork just enough for her knuckles to lose their color. Most people would have missed that tiny movement. I didn't. After 4 decades together, I noticed everything about the woman I loved. I placed my hand gently over hers beneath the table. She looked at me, trying once again to smile. "I'm fine," she whispered so quietly that only I could hear it. But she wasn't fine, and neither was I. They all believed my silence meant I had accepted what happened. They thought I was simply another old man trying to avoid family conflict. None of them realized that before this dinner ended, the story they had been telling themselves about our family was about to change forever. Eleanor had always believed that a family was measured by the little things people remembered long after expensive gifts had been forgotten. She remembered birthdays without writing them down. She knew exactly how everyone liked their coffee. She could tell when one of our grandchildren had a cold simply by hearing their voice over the telephone. For more than 40 years, she quietly became the center that held our family together, and the remarkable part was that she never once asked for recognition. She simply believed that love was supposed to be given freely. When Ryan was 8 years old and broke his arm falling from the old maple tree behind our first house, Eleanor slept in the chair beside his bed for 3 nights because he was afraid to wake up alone. When he left for college, she mailed handwritten letters every Sunday with newspaper clippings she thought he would enjoy reading. When he married Vanessa, she welcomed her into our family with the same warmth she would have shown her own daughter. She spent weeks helping plan the wedding, carefully sewing tiny details onto table decorations because Vanessa wanted everything to look perfect without exceeding the budget. Not once did Eleanor complain about the hours or the aching joints that followed. She simply smiled whenever someone thanked her and quietly cleaned up after everyone else had gone home. That was who my wife had always been. She never believed kindness was something that should be earned. She believed it should be offered first. Looking around that dining room, I wondered when everyone had forgotten those years. Maybe gratitude disappears slowly. Maybe people grow so accustomed to generosity that they begin treating it as something ordinary instead of something precious. I watched my granddaughter glance toward Eleanor with uncertainty, almost as though she wanted to say something but could not find the courage. She was home from college, still young enough to recognize unfairness, but old enough to understand how complicated family loyalty could become. The candles continued burning between the serving dishes while the conversation slowly restarted around us. It was awkward at first. Someone commented on the weather forecast. Someone else asked about a neighborhood construction project. They were pretending nothing important had happened. Families become surprisingly skilled at that. They cover painful moments with ordinary conversation until silence feels easier than honesty. Eleanor reached for the bowl of green beans and politely asked whether anyone wanted more. Her voice remained steady. If someone had walked into the room at that exact moment, they never would have guessed she had just been humiliated in front of the people she loved most. That quiet strength was one of the reasons I fell in love with her all those years ago. I remembered our first apartment, barely 600 square feet, where the kitchen table doubled as my work desk because we could not afford anything larger. We counted every dollar then. Some weeks dinner was soup and homemade bread because it stretched the grocery budget. Eleanor always managed to make those evenings feel rich anyway. She would light one inexpensive candle, put on soft music from an old radio, and somehow convince me that we had everything we needed. Together we built a life that was never extravagant, but always full. We worked overtime, saved patiently, paid every bill, and slowly created the home where every person now sitting around this table had celebrated birthdays, holidays, graduations, and new beginnings. Every memory in this house carried Eleanor's fingerprints, even if no one noticed anymore. I finally looked at Ryan again. My son was not a cruel man. At least, he had not been raised to become one. Yet silence has a way of becoming agreement when it lasts too long. He avoided meeting my eyes because somewhere deep inside he knew that allowing disrespect was not much different from speaking it himself. Eleanor reached beneath the table and gently squeezed my hand instead of the other way around. It was almost as if she wanted to comfort me for what had happened to her. That single gesture settled something inside me. I realized that protecting the peace had cost her enough already. Some lessons arrive quietly, without raised voices or dramatic confrontations. As I looked across the familiar faces gathered around our table, I understood that before this evening was over, every person in that room was finally going to remember exactly who Eleanor Walker truly was. The truth was that Sunday night was not the beginning of our family's problems. It was only the first time they had become impossible to ignore. Looking back, I could trace the changes almost year by year, each one so small that it never seemed worth confronting. Shortly after Ryan married Vanessa, family dinners slowly stopped feeling like family dinners. Eleanor would prepare everyone's favorite recipes, but Vanessa always arrived with a different suggestion. She would smile warmly and say that traditions needed to evolve because younger families did things differently. At first, it sounded perfectly reasonable. Eleanor even thanked her for the ideas. Then birthdays were moved to restaurants because cooking at home was supposedly too stressful. Thanksgiving became catered because homemade meals were called old-fashioned. Christmas morning started later because Vanessa preferred everyone to follow her schedule. None of those decisions seemed cruel on their own, yet every single change quietly erased something Eleanor had spent decades building. She never complained. Instead, she adjusted every plan with the same gentle smile she always wore. I noticed something else as well. Vanessa had an unusual talent for making hurtful remarks sound almost harmless. If Eleanor forgot where she placed her reading glasses, Vanessa would laugh and say that old age was catching up. If Eleanor became tired after walking through the grocery store, Vanessa would suggest that perhaps retirement communities offered more activities for people her age. Whenever someone looked uncomfortable, Vanessa immediately followed with, "I am only teasing. You know I love you." That sentence became her shield. It allowed every insult to disappear beneath forced laughter. Ryan always smiled awkwardly instead of correcting her. Sometimes he even laughed because disagreeing with his wife seemed more difficult than disappointing his mother. Eleanor noticed it too, although she never spoke badly about either of them. One afternoon several months before that dinner, I found her carefully folding a collection of family photographs into a storage box. I asked why she was putting them away when they had always decorated the hallway. She smiled without looking at me and said that perhaps the younger generation wanted a more modern style. Later that evening, I learned Vanessa had suggested replacing the photographs with abstract artwork because she thought the house looked dated whenever guests visited. Eleanor quietly removed every picture before anyone else had the chance. She said it was easier that way. Another time, our granddaughter asked Eleanor to teach her the cinnamon roll recipe everyone loved. Before Eleanor could answer, Vanessa interrupted and said they should probably learn healthier recipes instead because nobody really baked like that anymore. I watched the excitement disappear from Eleanor's face in less than a second. She simply nodded and changed the subject. It happened so quickly that everyone else continued eating as though nothing had happened. Those tiny moments accumulated like dust settling across old furniture. One by one, they covered the warmth that had always filled our home. I often wondered whether Vanessa understood the damage she caused or whether she genuinely believed every comment was harmless. Either way, the result was the same. Eleanor slowly stopped offering opinions. She asked fewer questions. She apologized for things that needed no apology. Even her laughter became quieter. As I sat beside her that evening, listening to ordinary conversation resume around the table, I realized I had spent too many years hoping kindness alone would eventually solve everything. Some people mistake patience for permission. Some mistakes become habits because nobody is willing to interrupt them. I looked at the familiar faces surrounding us and understood that every silent compromise had led us to this exact moment. And for the first time in many years, I was no longer willing to let silence speak on our behalf. The conversation around the table slowly became louder again, but it no longer sounded like family to me. It sounded like strangers carefully avoiding the one subject that mattered. Vanessa continued speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. She complimented the new neighborhood coffee shop, talked about an upcoming vacation, and laughed at stories that no one seemed genuinely interested in hearing. Every few minutes, she glanced toward Eleanor with the quiet confidence of someone convinced she had already won. My wife remained gracious. She passed serving dishes, thanked people for their compliments about dinner, and even asked our granddaughter how her classes were going. Anyone watching from outside would have believed everything was perfectly normal. Only I noticed the small changes. Eleanor barely touched the roast she had spent hours preparing. Her coffee cooled untouched beside her plate. Every now and then she gently rubbed the edge of her wedding band with her thumb, a habit she had whenever she was trying to steady herself without letting anyone else notice. 42 years of marriage had taught me to read those silent conversations she carried inside herself. She was not angry. She was wondering what she had done wrong. That thought broke my heart more than Vanessa's careless words ever could. Eleanor had always searched for ways to improve herself instead of blaming other people. Even now, she was probably replaying every conversation in her mind, asking herself whether she had somehow embarrassed Vanessa first. She would never imagine that some people simply enjoyed feeling superior. Across the table, Ryan finally cleared his throat. For a brief moment, I believed he was about to speak on his mother's behalf. Instead, he smiled awkwardly and asked whether anyone wanted dessert. Vanessa immediately answered that she would love pie if it was not too sweet, because people our age needed to watch their sugar. A few nervous laughs followed again. I watched Ryan lower his eyes once more. His silence was becoming heavier than any words he could have spoken. I remembered teaching him as a little boy that character was measured by how someone treated the quietest person in the room. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that lesson. Eleanor slowly stood and carried several empty plates toward the kitchen before anyone offered to help. Instinctively, I stood beside her and gathered the rest. She looked at me with that familiar gentle expression and whispered that she could manage. I quietly answered that she had managed enough for one lifetime. She gave me a faint smile, but I noticed tears beginning to gather in her tired eyes before she turned away. In the kitchen, the warm scent of apple pie filled the room. The dishwasher hummed softly, while the old clock above the pantry ticked with steady certainty. It reminded me of countless evenings when this house had echoed with laughter instead of cautious silence. Eleanor carefully placed each plate into the sink as though keeping her hands busy would prevent her emotions from escaping. She apologized to me for the uncomfortable dinner, even though she had done absolutely nothing that required an apology. That single sentence settled every doubt I still carried. The woman who had devoted her entire adult life to protecting this family was now apologizing for being publicly embarrassed inside her own home. I dried my hands with a kitchen towel and looked through the doorway toward the dining room, where everyone continued talking without us. At that moment, I finally understood something I should have realized years earlier. Respect does not disappear all at once. It fades one unanswered insult at a time until someone finally decides the next insult will be the last. I folded the towel neatly onto the counter, glanced toward the old oak cabinet beside the hallway, and made a quiet decision that none of them saw coming. Inside that cabinet rested something I had not touched in years, and before this evening ended, every person sitting at my table was going to understand why I had kept it safe for so long. I walked calmly into the hallway while the sound of quiet conversation drifted from the dining room behind me. No one paid much attention. They probably assumed I was checking on the coffee or looking for extra dessert plates. That was the advantage of growing older. People often stopped wondering what you were doing because they assumed nothing important would happen. The oak cabinet stood exactly where it had been for more than 20 years. Its brass handle had grown smooth from decades of use. I opened the lower drawer and reached behind a neatly folded stack of table linens until my fingers touched a thick cream-colored envelope. Eleanor knew it was there. Almost no one else did. I carried it back without rushing. When I stepped into the dining room again, the conversations gradually faded. Vanessa smiled politely, perhaps expecting me to ask whether anyone wanted another slice of pie. Instead, I placed the envelope gently beside my dinner plate and resumed my seat. Eleanor looked at me with quiet curiosity, but said nothing. She trusted me enough to know that if I had chosen this moment, there was a reason. Ryan noticed the envelope first. "Dad, what is that?" he asked. I rested both hands on the table before answering. "Something your mother asked me to keep safe many years ago." Vanessa laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." I returned her smile, but mine carried no amusement. "It is not mysterious. It is simply something that became important because all of us forgot what this family was built upon." The room became still again. Even the ticking clock seemed louder than before. I slowly opened the envelope and removed several neatly organized documents along with a small bundle of handwritten letters tied together by a faded blue ribbon. The letters were worn at the edges from being read over the years. Eleanor recognized them immediately. Her eyes widened, and she quietly whispered my name. I nodded gently before looking back at everyone else. "Many years ago, when Ryan was still in high school, your mother and I met with our attorney while updating our estate plan. At the time, we also wrote letters explaining why certain decisions were made. We hoped those letters would never need to be read while we were still alive." Ryan shifted uneasily in his chair. Vanessa folded her arms, but continued smiling with the confidence of someone who believed paperwork could not possibly matter. I picked up one of the letters, careful not to unfold it just yet. "This is Eleanor's handwriting. She wrote it after spending an entire weekend organizing old family photographs, recipes, and keepsakes so that one day every generation would remember where they came from. She did not write about money. She did not write about property. She wrote about respect." No one interrupted. Our granddaughter leaned forward slightly, watching every movement. I continued in the same calm voice. "She believed that possessions could always be replaced. Character could not. That is why every major decision we made as a couple included one simple expectation. The people entrusted with our legacy would first demonstrate kindness toward the people who built it." Vanessa finally spoke, her smile beginning to fade. "I am sure we have all been kind." I looked directly at her for the first time that evening. Kindness is not measured by compliments offered when everything is easy. It is measured by how we speak when we believe there will be no consequences. Ryan lowered his head. Eleanor reached for my hand beneath the table again, but this time it was not to comfort me. It was because she finally understood that the years of silent endurance were coming to an end. I carefully unfolded the first letter and realized that within the next few minutes, every person sitting around that table would hear words written decades earlier that now carried more truth than any of us had imagined. My hands remained steady as I unfolded the first letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but Eleanor's handwriting was still as graceful as the day she wrote it. I paused for a moment before reading the opening lines aloud. If you are hearing these words, then I hope our family still remembers that love without respect cannot survive for very long. No one spoke. Even Vanessa stopped pretending to smile. I continued reading. Thomas and I never wanted our children or grandchildren to measure success by the size of a house or the balance of a bank account. We wanted them to remember the people who quietly stood beside them when nobody else was watching. I glanced toward Eleanor. Tears rested quietly in her eyes, but this time they were different. They were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of remembering a promise we had made together many years earlier. I placed the letter gently on the table and reached for the documents beneath it. When we updated our estate plan, I said calmly, our attorney encouraged us to leave our property in equal shares. We considered that. Instead, we chose something different. Ryan finally looked directly at me. Dad, what are you talking about? I slid one document across the table without raising my voice. Your mother insisted that every inheritance remain in a family trust until we were confident the people receiving it understood the responsibility that came with it. Vanessa frowned. I do not understand why this has anything to do with tonight. I met her eyes. It has everything to do with tonight. The room fell silent again. The trust includes something that many people considered unusual. It is called a family values provision. It does not reward perfection. It simply allows us to reconsider distributions if someone consistently demonstrates behavior that harms the dignity or well-being of immediate family members. Ryan blinked in surprise. That is legal? Yes, I answered. It was written carefully years ago because your mother believed money should never become more important than character. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair for the first time all evening. You cannot be serious. You are making this about one joke. I shook my head. No, Vanessa. I am making this about years of choices. Tonight simply made those choices impossible to ignore. I slowly gathered several handwritten notes from the envelope. These are not accusations. They are dated records Eleanor and I kept whenever important family decisions affected everyone. We rarely wrote about finances. Most of these pages describe conversations, holidays, birthdays, and moments when kindness was either shown or forgotten. We never intended to use them. We hoped we never would. Ryan rubbed his forehead as understanding slowly settled over him. He recognized several dates immediately. The Christmas gathering that had suddenly changed locations. The family photographs that disappeared from the hallway. The birthday dinner Eleanor quietly canceled after being told her plans were old-fashioned. None of those memories had seemed significant at the time. Together, they revealed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding. Our granddaughter looked toward her grandmother with visible sadness. Grandma, she whispered softly, I had no idea you felt this way. Eleanor gently shook her head. I never wanted anyone to choose sides, she answered quietly. I only wanted us to keep being a family. Her words hung in the room, longer than any argument ever could. They carried no anger, only honesty. I looked around the table one last time before placing the documents neatly back into their folder. Your mother spent decades protecting this family from unnecessary pain, I said. Tonight, it is finally my turn to protect her. For the first time since dinner began, no one searched for another subject. No one laughed nervously. Every person sitting at that table understood that the evening had changed course, and that the next word spoken would shape our family's future far more than anyone had expected when they first sat down together. Ryan was the first to break the silence. He leaned back in his chair as though the weight of the past several years had suddenly settled across his shoulders. He looked from the folder to his mother, then toward me, and finally lowered his eyes to the table. Mom, he said quietly, I honestly did not see it the way I see it now. Eleanor answered him with the same gentle expression she had carried throughout the evening. She did not rush to comfort him, nor did she accuse him. She simply listened. That alone seemed to make Ryan even more uncomfortable. I kept telling myself these were small things, he continued. I thought everyone was just adjusting to different personalities. Every time something happened, I convinced myself it was easier to stay quiet than make a disagreement even bigger. I nodded slowly. Silence often feels easier in the moment, I said, but it usually becomes much more expensive later. Vanessa folded her hands together and let out a slow breath. For the first time since arriving that evening, the confidence had disappeared from her face. I never meant to hurt anyone, she said. I thought we were all joking with each other. I looked at her calmly. Then tell me honestly, if someone had spoken to your own mother the way Eleanor was spoken to tonight, would you have laughed? Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came. The answer was already written across her face. Across the table, our granddaughter quietly reached for Eleanor's hand. Grandma, I am sorry I never asked why the old family pictures disappeared. I thought you wanted a different style. Eleanor gave her fingers a gentle squeeze. You were never expected to carry the responsibility for decisions made by adults, she replied softly. I only wanted you to enjoy being part of this family. Those simple words seemed to affect everyone more deeply than any lecture ever could. My sister quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before admitting that she had noticed changes over the years, but had always assumed someone else would say something. My nephew confessed that he often felt uncomfortable during family gatherings, but convinced himself he was imagining the tension. One by one, people began acknowledging the moments they had ignored. None of them sounded proud. They sounded relieved that the truth no longer needed to remain hidden behind polite conversation. Ryan finally stood and walked around the table until he reached his mother. He stopped there for several seconds without speaking. Then he looked directly into her eyes. I cannot change the times I stayed quiet, he said. But I can admit that I failed you. You deserved better from your son. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair and embraced him. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no raised voices and no grand speeches. It was simply a mother choosing grace while allowing her son to carry responsibility for his own choices. Vanessa remained seated, watching them in silence. I could see that she was thinking carefully before speaking again. When she finally did, her voice was much softer than it had been all evening. Eleanor, she said, I have spent years believing confidence meant always having the last word. Tonight, I realized that I confused confidence with control. I am sorry for the things I said, and for the many moments I dismissed your kindness. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment before answering. An apology matters most when it becomes a different way of living tomorrow. No one argued with that. The room felt strangely lighter, not because every wound had disappeared, but because pretending had finally come to an end. As I gathered the letters and carefully returned them to the envelope, I realized something remarkable had happened. The documents had never changed our family. They had simply forced every person in that room to see themselves clearly for the first time in years. The evening did not end with celebration. It ended with quiet reflection, which somehow felt far more meaningful. After everyone helped clear the table, no one rushed toward the front door the way they usually did. Instead, people lingered in small conversations throughout the house, almost as though they were seeing it differently for the first time. Our granddaughter wandered into the hallway where the family photographs had once hung. She stood there for several moments before turning toward Eleanor. Grandma, she asked softly, would you ever put the pictures back? Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that I had not seen in quite some time. If everyone wants to remember the stories behind them, I would love that. Ryan immediately answered before anyone else could speak. I do. His voice was steady now. I think we all need those stories more than we realized. My sister nodded in agreement, recalling vacations, birthdays, and ordinary afternoons that had become treasured memories simply because someone had taken the time to gather everyone together. Vanessa remained unusually quiet as she helped wrap the leftover pie and place serving bowls into the refrigerator. Several times I noticed her looking toward Eleanor, as though searching for the right words. Eventually, she walked into the kitchen where Eleanor was drying the last dinner plate with a soft cotton towel. May I help you? Vanessa asked. Eleanor handed her another towel without hesitation. For several minutes, they worked side by side in comfortable silence. Then Vanessa spoke again. I spent so much time trying to make everything feel modern that I never stopped to ask why these traditions mattered in the first place. Eleanor folded the towel neatly before answering. Traditions are not about repeating the past. They are about reminding people they belong somewhere. Vanessa lowered her eyes. I think I forgot that belonging begins with making other people feel welcome. Eleanor gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Then begin there. Every family receives another chance when people choose humility over pride. I watched from the doorway without interrupting. No document could have created that conversation. No legal provision could have forced genuine understanding. The papers had only opened the door. Walking through it required something much more difficult. It required honesty. Later that evening, Ryan helped me return the envelope to the old oak cabinet. Before closing the drawer, he He looked at me and quietly said, "Dad, I hope those papers stay exactly where they are for a very long time." I smiled. So do I. Their greatest purpose is never being needed again. He nodded slowly, understanding what I meant. The true inheritance Eleanor and I hoped to leave behind had never been our home, our savings, or anything written by an attorney. It was the expectation that every generation would protect the dignity of the one before it. As everyone prepared to leave, our granddaughter surprised us by gathering the entire family into the living room for one new photograph. This time she insisted that Eleanor and I stand in the center while everyone else gathered around us. No one objected. Vanessa even adjusted the lighting before placing the camera on a shelf and hurrying back into the picture. After the camera captured the moment, she walked over to Eleanor once more. "Next Sunday," she said, "would you teach me how to make those cinnamon rolls? I would like to learn the recipe exactly the way you have always made it." Eleanor laughed softly, and the sound filled the room with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. "Of course," she answered, "but you have to promise not to rush the dough. Good things usually need a little patience." Everyone smiled, and for the first time that evening, the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It felt peaceful because it carried hope instead of avoidance, and I realized that while forgiveness never erases the past, it can quietly become the foundation for a better tomorrow. Several weeks passed before I truly understood what had changed inside our family. It was not that every disagreement had disappeared or that every conversation suddenly became perfect. Families do not heal that way. Healing arrives quietly, one ordinary moment at a time, until one day you realize the room feels lighter than it once did. Sunday dinners gradually returned to the rhythm Eleanor had loved for so many years. The old family photographs found their way back onto the hallway walls, each one carrying stories that our grandchildren now asked to hear instead of walking past without noticing. Vanessa kept her promise. Every Sunday afternoon she arrived an hour early, tied on one of Eleanor's old aprons, and patiently learned recipes that had been passed through our family for generations. Sometimes the cinnamon rolls rose beautifully. Sometimes they did not. Whenever they failed, Eleanor would simply smile and say that good memories were made just as often from imperfect batches as perfect ones. Ryan changed in quieter ways. He called his mother during the week for no special reason other than to ask how she was doing. He began helping around the house before anyone needed to ask. More importantly, he no longer confused keeping the peace with avoiding difficult conversations. I watched him gently correct small moments of disrespect before they had the chance to grow into larger problems. It was not because he feared losing an inheritance. It was because he finally understood that protecting someone's dignity was one of the greatest expressions of love. One afternoon, he helped me organize the garage, and while we worked, he looked over at me and said, "Dad, I spent years believing that providing for my family only meant working hard. I never realized it also meant having the courage to speak when someone I loved was being treated unfairly." I placed another box on the shelf and smiled. That lesson is worth far more than anything your mother and I could ever leave behind. As for the envelope, it remained exactly where it had always been, resting quietly inside the old oak cabinet beneath neatly folded table linens. I never opened it again. I hoped I never would. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. It reminded us that values written on paper mean very little unless they are lived around the dinner table every single day. One evening, our granddaughter stopped by after her college classes and handed Eleanor a framed copy of the family photograph we had taken that unforgettable night. She had written a single sentence beneath it in elegant handwriting. "The strongest families are not the ones that never make mistakes. They are the ones brave enough to make things right." Eleanor read those words twice before carefully placing the frame on the mantel above the fireplace. She did not say anything for several moments. Then she reached for my hand exactly as she had done thousands of times throughout our marriage. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon sunlight fill the living room we had built piece by piece over 4 decades. I realized then that respect is never guaranteed by age, titles, or even family ties. It grows from daily choices, quiet acts of kindness, and the willingness to protect the people who have spent their lives protecting everyone else. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I regret opening that old envelope. My answer is always the same. I do not remember that evening because someone was embarrassed. I remember it because truth finally replaced silence, and compassion finally became louder than pride. In the end, our greatest victory was never proving anyone wrong. It was reminding every person who gathered around our table that a home is not held together by walls, traditions, or even shared history. It is held together by respect, and once that respect is restored, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal.